Hi, and welcome to this edition of Let's Talk History. My name is Bain, and I'm a Ph.D. student at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine Campus, and of course, in the Department of History. In today's session, we are treating with a CAPE topic, which is Freedom in Action, Theme 2, Nationalism and Nation Building, and we are talking about the Cuban Revolution. So in our discussions today, we want to examine the rise of the figurehead of the revolution, Fidel Castro. Then we want to explore how this revolution transformed the Spanish-speaking island of Cuba. And finally, let's discuss how this national occurrence impacted the region and the world at large. So stay with us as we delve into the Cuban Revolution. Once more, our topic of discussion, the Cuban Revolution and its regional and international impact between 1959 and 1983. For a brief background, the Cuban Revolution, we must look at the Cold War. The Cold War was from 1945 to 1991. It was largely an ideological war between the proponents of capitalism and the proponents of communism. The most prominent promoter of capitalism was the United States of America, and the most prominent proponent of socialism, communism, was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. The Soviet Union is another term used, and the USSR is the acronym. The world generally was divided into three camps: those that were pro-communist, those that were anti-communist, and those that declared themselves to be non-aligned. A distinguishing mark of the Cold War was that the two foremost powers, the USA and the Soviet Union, did not directly engage each other in physical battle. And this was due to what has been termed mutually assured destruction. Because of the nuclear capabilities of both Washington and Moscow, any warfare that they would engage that would involve nuclear weapons would be extremely catastrophic. And so this kept them from engaging each other in direct battle. The Cold War also featured alliances such as the NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the Warsaw Pact. Just a brief idea: capitalism and socialism. The distinguishing mark of these two ideologies is the involvement of the state in the economy. Capitalism, the government has the responsibility of regulating the economy or regulating conditions in the economy, whereas in socialism, the government or the state dictates the economy, controls the distribution of wealth, controls the inputs into production. So that is the major difference between capitalism and socialism. Within the region, Cuba was not the only state that bared the way of communism or socialism. We had Cuba, of course, we had El Salvador. There was a movement in El Salvador. There were movements in Chile, Guyana, Jamaica, Grenada, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and the list goes on. So within the region, the Caribbean and Latin America, many states during the Cold War period were adopting leftist ideology, whether on a national level or within political parties and grassroots organizations. So we're getting more specific now, and we're looking at a background to the Cuban Revolution itself. And so briefly, we want to look at what predated 1959 or the 1953 to 1959 revolution. In 1898, There was the Spanish-American War, which is what we know it as, but really it was the Cuban War of Independence, where Cuba sought to free itself from Spanish colonization. The United States became involved, and from that moment, the United States held a permanent presence in various ways in Cuba until 1959. There was US control or influence in the economy, in the culture and society, in the politics of Cuba. Via the Platt Amendment 1901-1902, the US gave itself, I should say, the right to intervene into the political life of Cuba. And so via puppet presidencies, economic benefits, the US presence was felt in Cuba, which caused some agitation because the Cuban populace had gained independence, yet it seemed that they had exchanged one colonial master for an imperial master, which was the US. Other features before this revolution: socio-economic crises, the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer, the rise of the intelligentsia. There were greater numbers of students who were gaining access to tertiary education, both locally in Cuba and outside of Cuba. And so they were political thinkers, social thinkers that would lead the movement. Also, Latin America had a culture of revolution. The Latin American Wars of Independence predated those in the English-speaking Caribbean and the Caribbean in general to a large extent. So there was a culture of revolution to bring about change that predated the Cuban Revolution. The CAPE syllabus requests that we look at Fidel Castro and his rise. So we're going to point out a few. There's much to be learned, but we're going to point out a few key points about who Fidel Castro was and how he became the revolutionary that we know today. So Fidel Castro Ruz was born to a very well-to-do family in Cuba, and this enabled him and his siblings to have access to formal education from primary level up to tertiary level. Castro was described as an excellent athlete, a prolific debater, deep thinker. At the age of 19, he registered or enrolled in the University of Havana as a law student. While he was a student, he engaged in the Student Federation, so his political activism was being seen, although there were earlier signs, but now we are seeing it in action in a more visible way. And the period 1947 to 1959 has been dubbed as his period of ascendance. So after he graduated from the university, he traveled in Latin America, and this further formed his thinking and his revolutionary ideas as he saw various groups in these countries fighting for greater rights, fighting for equality, fighting for greater economic resources. So this shaped his thinking, shaped who he was. In Cuba, he was also involved in the Partido del Pueblo Cubano, which was led by Eduardo Chibas, the Party of the Cuban People. He was also involved with the Movimiento Socialista Revolucionario, which is the Revolutionary Socialist Movement, and the Unión Insurreccional Revolucionaria, the Insurrectional Revolutionary Union. So within this 1947 to 1953 period, Castro became heavily involved in the political life of Cuba. So he was educated in the classroom, but he was also educated in the real world, as we see, through his travel and his involvement in these political groups. And that brings us to some key points in the Cuban Revolution. So the first that we look at is the 26th of July, 1953. Fidel Castro commissioned an assault upon the Moncada as well as the Bayamo barracks. These were army bases in an attempt to overthrow the person at the helm of the Cuban political life at that time, a dictator, Fulgencio Batista. This insurrectionary activity or initiative failed. Over half of the revolutionaries were killed and others were imprisoned. Among those who were imprisoned were Fidel Castro and Raul Castro. Much has been said about the trial that Castro spoke at length at. And one of the key phrases that emerged from his defense of his actions and the actions of his revolutionaries was, "Condemn me. It does not matter. History will absolve me." So Castro and his brother, Raul Castro, were imprisoned. However, in 1955, Fulgencio Batista released them in a show of good faith, or in a show to bring a greater level of peace between the Cuban society and Batista's government. The Castro brothers fled to Mexico, where they were joined by other revolutionaries and also Cuban revolutionaries, and also Che Guevara, who has been known from that time as a folk hero, a great folk hero across the globe, where they began their preparations for another assault or another insurrectionary movement against the Batista regime. In November 1956, this group of about 80 men returned to Cuba from Mexico aboard a yacht called the Granma. However, this initiative also resulted in failure due to navigational difficulties. Certain writers also credit what we would call sellouts or informers, and many of these revolutionaries died, and the remainder fled to the Sierra Maestra Mountains, which would be their stronghold for the next 2 to 3 years, where they would engage Batista's forces in various wars, various battles, of which they were successful in many. As the pressure began mounting within the society, but also within the mountain warfare, many of Batista's forces defected from the army. And under this mountain pressure, in late 1958, Batista fled Cuba between the 31st December and the 1st of January. He fled Cuba, and the July 26 movement, born of course on July 26, 1953, as we see here, assumed power. At the top of the slide, we have 4 of the leading figures of this revolutionary movement. Of course, first we have Fidel Castro Ruz, then we have Raul Che Guevara, the Argentinian doctor and revolutionary, Raul Castro, and Camilo Cienfuegos. Camilo Cienfuegos died shortly after the revolution, as well as Che Guevara in the 60s died. The next major objective of the syllabus is to examine the transformation of Cuba under this new socialist regime. So Camila Mesa-Lago points out 5 phases between 1959 and 1977, and we will briefly look at those. So 1959 to 1961, the first 2 years of the revolutionary government was an ill-defined period. The revolutionaries, now in government, were gaining their footing. So there was not a pure structure to the governance. 1961 to 1963, the revolution was declared then as socialist in 1961, and an attempt to adhere to a Soviet model followed. Following that period, which saw many difficulties, the Cuban government sought to indigenize the revolutionary process. So make it more specific, make their policies, their laws more specific to the Cuban realities. 1966 to 1970, there was more experimentation, drawing on experiences from China in the Chinese leftist movement and Che Guevara's thought, political, military thought, and economic thought. And following this period, the syllabus stops at 1970, but following this period to present, there has been further development, further evolution of the Cuban Revolution. Once more, we're going to become a little more specific. So how did socialism in Cuba impact various spheres of Cuban life? CAPE syllabus has themes as a keyword. So themes here we can categorize the various changes under political transformation. So we have political life, state economic control, we have economic life, we have the military, and then we have socio-cultural life, social planning. So in the political sphere, the guiding ideology of the nation was changed to socialism or communism. There was now a one-party state. There was not multiple political parties that would compete for elections. There was one state, one party within the state. That was the Partido Comunista de Cuba, the Cuban Communist Party, that was at the helm of politics and that influenced very heavily the political life of Cuba. And this, of course, has led to it being called a dictatorship, because there was one party dictating the affairs of Cuba. State economic control. We alluded earlier to the importance of capitalism and socialism as economic ideologies. And we said that socialism featured a very interventionist policy of the state within the economy, or extreme state control. And this featured agrarian reform, the seizing of lands, the redistribution of lands, and the methods by which agricultural production would occur. There was the nationalization of industries and commercial institutions. Before the Cuban Revolution, there were many multinational corporations and foreign countries, especially the US, that exercised extreme control and influence in the economic life of Cuba. Now the Cuban government was seizing these banks and hotels and industrial complexes and bringing it under the direct control of the state. Due to some of the economic policies that were established, there were shortages of products, food products, cosmetic products, and clothing products within the state. So there was rationing of some of the products and services within Cuba. Each family was allotted a certain amount of, let's say, rice or flour or cheese per month or so. Collectivism. There was the desire to share the wealth equally. That was the desire, the goal among the population. So produce was collected and redistributed by the state. The Cuban state became highly militarized to ensure that the revolution was secured internally, but also from foreign attack. And there was great social planning, especially in the realm of healthcare, education, and living. So there was free universal healthcare, there were literacy and education campaigns, there were rehoming initiatives within Cuba. So these are some of the ways. There are many others we could discuss, but time would not permit. Now we want to look at some of what we would deem positive and what we deem negative effects on the Cuban life. Some positives: free universal healthcare, educational strides and literacy achievements were remarkable. Greater equality. Of course, the society did not now become equal, but there was greater equality than previously. And the necessities that the Cuban population now face led to a lot of innovative ideas, especially in the realm of biomedical engineering, which we see to a great extent today. And as we all know, history is not just about the past, but it also informs the present. And recently with the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw that Cuba developed its own vaccine. This has its roots in the Cuban Revolution, which led to a lot of innovation. Some negative aspects: isolation. Cuba now gained a greater number of enemies. There was a mass exodus and exile of citizens. Those who did not agree, were not comfortable, were facing extreme hardships because of this new regime, fled Cuba in droves. We had the Mariel exodus in the 1980s, where over 100,000 Cubans fled Cuba. And they were not alone. There were others before and others continued. So the breaking up of families was also a negative consequence. Economic stagnation. Because the economy was so controlled and not free, there was stagnation. Growth levels were not as before or as in other countries that had freer economies. And the strong state intervention caused a lot of discomfort for many of the citizens of Cuba. the state being involved in their family life, in their health, in their education, in their religious practices. Now we turn to Cuba's international relation. In positive and negative dimensions, there were consequences. And we are just listing, again, a few. In the positive sphere, the Cuban government gained a powerful ally in the Soviet Union. Cuban prestige internationally grew, and this was due to their defiant attitude, which nationalistic and anti-US governments and movements across the globe favored or promoted or found admirable. The heroes such as Che Guevara and Fidel Castro gained prominence, gained international fame. Cuba engaged, following their revolutionary process or revolutionary war, in internationalism, whereby they would send skilled workers, doctors, teachers, construction workers, nurses, to other countries in the developing world to assist them. So this raised the profile of Cuba as a helper in the international system and led to new allies being gained. However, simultaneously, as Cuba gained an ally, it gained an enemy. There was a strong antagonistic relationship between Cuba and the US, and that has persisted over time. The US saw Cuba as a Soviet subversive network, as a disciple of the Soviet Union that would destabilize the region, and the Cubans saw the US as an aggressor, as an imperialist power that desired to control Cuba. Because of this tension, there was isolation and hostility in the region. In international relations, Cuba lost trading relationships, and there was regional tension. We're going to look at some of the ways that Cuba sought to isolate or contain the influence, the US sought to isolate or contain the influence of Cuba. They instituted an economic blockade in the 1960s, early 1960s, that cut trading relationships between the US and Cuba. They organized military and paramilitary intervention. We know about the Bay of Pigs invasion, or we should know about the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, where exiles or dissidents of the Cuban Revolution were trained by the CIA and attempted to invade Cuba, but they were very much unsuccessful. Many died or were imprisoned. The US also engaged in military intimidation via maneuvers. They would deploy troops to the waters nearby to Cuba, or islands and countries nearby to Cuba, in a grand show of US military power to remind Cuba of the military might of the US in the region. Propaganda, they engaged the press, the print media, radio, television, to defame the Cuban leaders, to defame the Cuban Revolution, and attempt to pressure Cuba into conforming to a type of government that the US could live more peaceably with. They provided support for exiles in Florida and elsewhere in the region to launch attacks at the Cuban Revolution. They supported regional states under the condition that they did not engage in a diplomatic relationship with Cuba. And they excluded Cuba from regional initiatives such as the Caribbean Basin initiatives, such as the Organization of American States, on the grounds that they were communists and they did not engage in a free market economy. So the relationship was highly antagonistic. And of course, because of the power and might of the United States, it was felt more dramatically and more meaningfully by Cuba. That is, of course, not to say that Cuba did not also launch its own forms of attacks against the US. As we alluded to previously, Cuba in the region was seen in positive and negative lights, but they were also seen as internationalists who assisted with health, education, and industry. They were viewed as a friend to progressive movements. They were stoker of revolutionary fire. The Cuban Revolution inspired many other movements in Latin America and the Caribbean to engage in guerrilla warfare and leftist movements to revolutionize society and bring greater levels of equality for the masses. Cuba was also seen as a danger in the region that would draw the US's antagonism, that would cause countries to turn from democracy to communist dictatorships. So it was a mixture of positive and negative in the region. The syllabus takes us to 1983, because that is the year that the Grenadian Revolution came to an end. The Grenadian Revolution was from 1979 to 1983, and it was a leftist revolution led by Maurice Bishop, Bernard Cord, Hudson Austin, and others. The revolutionaries gained victory in a largely bloodless coup on March 13, 1979, when they attacked the True Blue barracks in Grenada. They instituted a government that was deemed to be democratic socialist, and they had a very strong friendship with Cuba. They received assistance from Cuba and as well partnered with Cuba to exchange support economically, socially, socio-culturally, and in the military or in defense between 1979 to 1983. This relationship also brought some tension in the region, as an English-speaking Caribbean island was adopting a strong leftist government and partnering with Cuba, whom the US had great issues with. In 1983, following an internal crisis in which Maurice Bishop and many of his associates were killed, the US took the opportunity to invade Grenada and bring that leftist revolution to an end. And this close partnership ended at that point. There is so much more we can say about the Cuban Revolution, but we'd be here for a long time. But what we can say with certainty is that the Cuban Revolution held extensive consequences for Cuba locally, for its people, for its political life, for its economy. It also held great consequences for the region and the world at large. In this larger framework of the Cold War, this small Spanish-speaking island was a beacon for many and set off warning bells for others. And it brought, in the Cold War, one of the most heated moments. That was the Cuban Missile Crisis, whereby the Castro government and the USSR arranged for missiles to be brought to Cuba. And a spy plane of US origin picked up on what was occurring. And this led to one of the most tense periods in the global Cold War. So again, we see how much of an impact this small island had on the world at large. These are the sources of the images used. And here we have some literary sources, just a few, there are so many, that inform this presentation and you can access for further information. Well, that's it for now. And keep joining with us here at the Department of History, UB St. Augustine, as we explore topics in our nation, in our region, and in our world at large. Bye for now.